Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to go into your lecture discussion and write down which of the four statements from the previous lecture that you agreed with the most. Now we're going to resume our History of Psychology lecture. I want to emphasize that psychology had its roots in philosophy. And what separates psychology from philosophy is that psychology attempts to study behavior under scientific conditions, whereas philosophers usually will simply come up with theories to explain how the world works. Also, psychology is different from philosophy is that it tends to focus specifically on explaining behavior, whereas philosophy may consume itself with other areas such as how the world works and so on and so forth. So here's a famous philosopher's theory. This was Hippocrates. He was about 500 BC. And I just wanted to show you a couple of philosophers' theories and how they related to psychology and how psychology grew from philosophy. So Hippocrates was a physician, and he was trying to explain personality. So he basically said that personality results from the ratio of humors or fluids that were in our body. So someone that was kind of aggressive, irritable, touchy, restless, aggressive, they had a ratio of more yellow bile than the other humors, whereas somebody who was like a leader, carefree, easygoing, lively, they had more, they were dominated by the humor of blood. Then we have some people who are very even-tempered and calm, thoughtful, peaceful. They are more dominated by phlegm. And then we also have kind of the depressive, the melancholic personality, and they are more dominated by black bile. Now what's interesting about this theory here is that it was written in 500 BC. This was before we had microscopes, before we have all the medical inventions. But now in the year we find that again we're trying to explain personality by fluids, but instead of calling them humors, we're talking about neurotransmitters. For example, depression, which would be kind of the melancholic state, may be caused or may be related to low levels of serotonin. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and being irritable, lots of yellow bile, aggressive, excitable, changeable, may be related to excessive amounts of testosterone or high levels of testosterone. And then someone who's a great leader, they found that they did a study at USC and UCLA, and they looked at all the leaders on campus, like the captain of the debate team and the captain of the football team, the student government body president, and they tested their blood levels of serotonin as opposed to the average student who was not a leader, and they found that the leaders had higher levels of serotonin. Someone who's passive, careful, thoughtful, their personality again may be related to the amount of hormones or neurotransmitters that they have in their body. So a hormone is a chemical that's carried by the blood, and a neurotransmitter is a chemical that's usually released between neurons in the brain. So Hippocrates in 500 BC says that our personality is dominated by the fluids in our body, and we are still saying perhaps our personality is dominated by fluids in our body. It's very interesting how things tend to become full circle. Let's take a look at another famous philosopher. This is Descartes. You've probably heard of him before. And what's interesting is he was wrestling with a question that I think a lot of us are probably still wrestling with. And that's, is there something more to us? Are we just a series of chemical reactions? When we die, do we just die? Is that it? And so he was trying to talk about, is there something more? The nature of the soul. And so what the story is of Descartes is that when he was a young man, he lived outside of the Palace of Versailles. And at the Palace of Versailles, they had this statue garden. And they were mechanical statues. But when you walked along through the garden, there was like a flat plate over a bag of water. And the bag of water would run up a hose. And the hose would create a hydraulic pressure in the statue, and so when you stepped on the plate, it would push the water and it would make the statue move. So being that this was the time before the internet and all the rock and roll music, everything, this was very fascinating. This was probably the equivalent to a Disneyland back then. And he loved this statue garden. He would ask his parents to take him there when he was young. And as he grew older, he said, I wonder if humans are like those statues, that we have fluids running through our body, and that's what makes us move. Um, but and so he kind of came up with this theory, but then he had a problem. Is Descartes was a very, very religious man, and so he was trying to figure out, well, if we're just fluids running around in our body and that's what's making us move, then where is the soul? So Descartes joined the army. We're not sure why he joined the army, but he did, and it was rumored that he, after the battles, he would go out on the battlefield and he would look at all the dead bodies. And he noticed that in the middle of the brain, the dead center of the brain, as you can see, I've highlighted it in blue, there's this perfect circle. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. It's in the dead center of the brain. It's a very circular object. And he thought that that was where the soul was. And so he thought that our body was basically just a series of interactions from the fluids that were running through us, but then our soul was located in this one spot, and that when we died, our soul would go on. So it's kind of the difference between the physical and the body, so on and so forth. I still can't answer the question, and I think it's a question that a lot of us still wrestle with, and it's a very important question to psychology, is do we have a soul? Are we in control of our actions, or is there something that controls us? But if we do have a soul, then it's probably not located just in that perfect circle, because we now know that to be called the pineal gland. And what the pineal gland does is the pineal gland actually kind of regulates our sleep cycle. The optic nerve fibers run back to the pineal gland, and so when the sun comes up, it stops the pineal gland from releasing a hormone called melatonin. This will raise our body temperature and give us more energy. When the sun is down, it lowers our body temperature and allows us to go to sleep. So if any of you have had jet lag where you cross over time zones and then all of a sudden you can't get to sleep at night, it's probably because the melatonin cycle is still on your old time. It's not influenced directly. Also, some of you that have difficulties on cloudy days or rainy days, maybe you're a little bit more depressed, or maybe you eat more carbohydrates, you just don't have as much energy, you can attribute that to the pineal gland and its release of melatonin. On cloudy days, the melatonin is still circulating through your body, and so you have a slightly lower body temperature and it makes you have less energy. However, this is not true for all people. Some people seem to be more affected by this than others. There are actually some people, but I want to let you know that you are in the minority, that say you actually have more energy on cloudy days.